Hello, my dear students. I'm CA Rafiq. I'm pleased to welcome you to this presentation on Chapter 1, the concepts of governance and management of information systems. We'll be discussing today Part 3 of the 5-part series of presentations. Here we'll be discussing in detail what is risk management. Risk management is a key aspect of an enterprise, not only of enterprise, but also of any professionals. Let's have a quick overview of the topics we'll be covering in this presentation. First, we'll understand what is this information system risk and the relationship of risk management. If you remember, the context of the ISCA paper is we are looking at all areas pertaining to information technology deployment in terms of the risk, security, control, and audit. The most important aspect of any enterprise to ensure that the goals are achieved is to manage the risk, and this is what we'll be discussing. Now, this chapter could be very simple or complex depending on how you approach this topic. If you understand the concepts from a practical perspective, you find this is very easy. But if you try to memorize, this is going to be quite difficult. Now, I'll relate these topics as we discuss with practical examples so that it becomes easy for you to understand. There are various types of risks, and these arise from multiple sources. We'll have a look at the different types of risks which could happen and how they will impact the enterprise and prevent the enterprise from achieving the enterprise objectives, and what is the risk mitigation strategy an enterprise needs to have. In any subject, it's important you need to understand the vocabulary. We'll also understand some of the key terms. Once you understand the key terms pertaining to the subject, then you find understanding the concepts become much more easier, and applying also becomes much more easier. If you've not gone through the presentation or the introduction of this topic, I suggest you please go through the video, because there also we have provided a macro perspective of how ISCA is to be studied, and some of the key concepts pertaining to risk management have also been introduced in the introductory lecture. Risks have to be managed, and you need to manage as per a particular strategy. What should be the risk management strategy? How does enterprises manage strategy? What should be the approach? This is what we'll be discussing in the risk management strategy. There is a structured approach. We'll discuss what is the structured approach. And risk management is something which most of you are doing. We're related to your understanding and see how this can be adopted or extended to the enterprise, and especially in the context of IT deployment. There are also best practices which can be used to implement risk management, and this is where we'll look at risk management from the perspective of governance. There are also management practices for risk management, and we will be going through the key management practices. IT, considering its criticality, has not only to manage, but it has to be governed. So we'll look at what are the best practices for risk management from the governance perspective and from the management perspective. And for implementing and accomplishing anything, you need to have metrics. An enterprise has to perform risk management on a dynamic basis because the environment is dynamic, it keeps on changing. So you need to have metrics to know how well the risks are being measured and managed. So we'll also look at some of the sample metrics of risk management. Let us discuss what is risk management. Now, if you look at the key word here, we are looking at risk and we look at management. So it's all about management of risk if you look at it very simplistically. But from the point of ISCA, you need to look at from a governance perspective. We already discussed in part 1 of the presentation what is governance. If you have already seen the presentation on the introduction to ISCA, you would also understood the concepts of risk, security, control, and audit. And this is being done for technology. So what is important is we need to understand in any enterprise, there is a technology which is being used. This technology gives rise to new types of risks. These risks need to be mitigated by using the security features in the technology. These security features have to be configured as per the needs of the organization, and there's control, and this somebody has to review independently, and you have an audit. So an auditor will look at, first of all, what is the technology which has been deployed, on account of the technology deployment, what are the type of risks which emerges? The organization needs to have a risk management strategy to mitigate this risk. And to mitigate this risk, they would have used the security features which are available in technology. They would have implemented the right security and control features which are there by configuring behind the right policies, procedures, practices. And as an auditor, you'll review fundamentally whether the risks are mitigated behind the right controls. In an ideal situation, you need to have controls which will mitigate the risk. But quite often, as in life, risk can never be eliminated. Risk always remains. So you need to have a risk management strategy, how you're going to mitigate this risk. This is what we are going to discuss in this particular topic of risk management. Now, we are looking at risk from a governance perspective. That's where we have the concept of risk management. We're also going to look at risk from the perspective of IT. That's why it's called as IT risk management. And for implementing IT governance, ERM and IT risk management are key components, which means IT governance has to be an integral part of the corporate governance. If you look at any corporate governance report, you'll find in most of the cases, they will talk about the enterprise risk management. They'll also talk about the risk management strategy which is being adopted in the enterprise. So in this presentation, we'll discuss and understand what is risk management and how risk management is done from the context of enterprise risk management and also from the perspective of governance. The fundamental aspect when you're doing risk management is to do a risk assessment. Risk assessment, which means you assess where you are as per the risks are concerned. What types of risks are there? What are the current level of controls? And based on that, what are the residual risks and whether these are acceptable? So you look at ideally where you are and where do you want to be and find out the gaps. When you do a risk assessment, one of the most important you will have to consider is what is the business impact. So this is where you do what is called the business impact analysis. And when you're doing from the context of risk, especially from the information systems, we call it information systems risk perspective. Now there are three key aspects for any effective deployment of technology. This is people, processes, and technology. Processes can be automated, technology using technology, but you need to have people who are trained to use this technology. And that's why you need to have regular communication among the management, and this should be right from the top to the bottom, where the risks are understood and effectively managed. I said risk cannot be completely mitigated, so you'll have risk are mitigated by implementing the right level of controls. So when you implement the controls to mitigate the risk, there is still a risk which could be left, and that is called as the residual risk. This residual risk needs to be knowingly accepted. The most important aspect when you're doing information systems audit is to ensure that you know what are the risks and whether these risks have been knowingly accepted. So based on this, you need to take appropriate action. So I hope you have been able to get a little more clarity on what the risk management is all about from the perspective of IT. Now let's get into the next aspect where we are discussing about information system risks. Information system risk refers to risk in the information systems which are used within the enterprise, which means you apply risk management to information systems. Let's understand what is the risk first of all. Now, I said risk is the possibility of something adverse happening resulting in a potential loss or exposure, or in simple terms, anything which can go wrong or which can prevent you from achieving your objectives, enterprise objectives or business objectives is risk. For example, you want to come from your home to your office, so you take a particular travel mode, you travel in a two-wheeler or four-wheeler. Now, if there is anything which can prevent you from achieving your objective, which means moving from your origination to the destination, and that is a risk. So what are the type of risks which can happen? There could be an accident, there could be a traffic jam, there could be a vehicle breakdown, there could be various things which can go wrong, which can prevent you from reaching your destination. All these are called as risks in general. The same thing you apply to an enterprise. Any enterprise is started by the stakeholders with the enterprise objectives or goals to be achieved. Now, there are events, these are called as potential events, which can prevent an organization from achieving these objectives, and these are called as risks. What is risk management is all about? Risk management is the process of assessing what are the different types of risks which can occur to the organization as it moves towards its origination to the destination in achieving its goals, and taking appropriate steps to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Now here if you see, we are not talking about elimination, we are talking about reduce the risk to an acceptable level. How do you reduce the risk? By implementing the right level of controls as required. And you should know controls always come with a cost. So you need to do a cost benefit analysis. So it means you need to have the right level of controls based on the risk and the value you derive from implementing the controls. So ultimately, when you do risk management, what you are looking at is ensuring that the level of risk which is there, the residual risk, is acceptable to the management. So the ultimate objective of doing risk management is to ensure that you are able to reduce the risk or bring the risk to the level of acceptable level. This is what is important. So in reading ISCA, you need to understand the key terminologies, what are the key concepts. Once you know this risk management, now you find in BCP also fundamentally it's all about risk management. So if you know what is risk management, probably 40% of BCP can be taken care of. You already understood. So all the chapters are all related, and that's how I've explained in the introductory part of the lecture as to how ISCA is all related. If you get the core concepts, you find there is a lot of overlap, repetition between the chapters. But if you don't understand the concept, you will only result in confusion. You find there is so much of repetition with different aspects explained in different ways in different chapters. But once you get the concept clearly, the underlying theme, then you find it becomes very easy to understand. In fact, you should spend the minimum amount of time on studying ISCA and you should be able to get the maximum amount of marks. But that will happen if you understand the subject. Now let's understand from the information system perspective. Any information system in a modern enterprise is mostly dependent on IT. When you are using IT, IT has its own inherent risks. And these inherent risks also need to be mitigated by implementing the right level of security. As auditors, we are supposed to evaluate. We will review and we evaluate whether the controls which are available. Now, if you look at the key terms, these 3 A's is important. Controls are available, adequate and appropriate. For what? To mitigate the risks. What is the objective of mitigating the risk? To bring the risk to an acceptable level. You remember this is what we discussed? This is what is the ultimate objective of the risk management. So the management is supposed to have done this. We have to verify and validate whether the management has done proper risk management to bring the risk to an acceptable level. Now let's go to the source of risk and say where does the risk emanate or originate? The risk could emanate from multiple factors. One, it could be from the commercial and the legal relationship. The entity is entering into different types of contracts for which you will have contracts, which means there are relationships which are there because of which you may have risks. For example, you have a relationship with a vendor who's supposed to provide a particular service. The vendor goes out of business or the vendor doesn't adhere to the contract. So there is a big risk. For example, you're depending on the network to provide service to the customers. That network service provider goes out of business or is not able to provide the service due to breakdown, and that will impact the service delivery to the customers. So this is one source of risk, your dependency on various vendors on which you have contracts. There could be economic circumstances, which means the economy changes. There is an impact on account of the changes which is happening in the economy. There's the human behavior. People who work in the organization, some of the persons decide that he has to commit a fraud. Now, because of which he has committed the error or a fraud, and that impacts the organization. There could be natural events. For example, there could be flood. There could be an earthquake. There could be political circumstances. The political system, the decision makers in the politics may take certain decisions which may impact the organization. For example, you are seeing demonetization has affected most of the enterprises. Or there could also be technology and technical issues which impact. For example, there could be failure of technology, or there is a breakdown of the network. You may have management activities and controls, which could also result in a risk. Or there could be individual activities which may result in a risk. So these are the different types of sources of risk. Now let's look at what are the attributes or characteristics of risk. So if there is a risk, you know there is a potential for loss, which means if there's no potential loss, you're not really bothered, you do not consider that as a risk. So you need to understand whenever there is a risk, there is a potential loss or exposure. Now, what is this because of? There is a threat and there is a vulnerability. So we'll discuss what is the threat and what is the vulnerability and how this impact the risk or how they create the risk. So you need to understand that there are threats and there are vulnerabilities in the inherent systems. And when the threat exploits the vulnerability, it results in a risk. There is uncertainty. When the threat exploits the vulnerability, there is a risk. On account of the risk, there is a loss, there is a potential loss. What is the extent of loss? What is the possibility that the threat will exploit the vulnerability? So these are all estimates, so which means these are uncertain. So you should know risk management is never certain, it is always uncertain. So there is a lot of subjectivity involved in assessing what is the impact of the risk. So you'll have to consider probability. For example, what is the probability there is a threat? What is the probability there is a fire? So you'll have to estimate based on certain factors wherever possible, whether information is available. So you'll have to look at the uncertainty of the factors to the extent you should be able to quantify it. And based on this, you should be able to look at the impact for the organization in terms of the loss and then assess what is the impact or the potential exposure to the loss. So there is a probability or the likelihood that the threat agent having an impact on the system or the organization's information systems through specific attacks. For example, there's a possibility a hacker can attack the information system of an enterprise. Now, what is the probability that the hacker will attack? So there is an estimate. And if there is an attack, what is the impact? What is the loss to the organization? These are aspects we do consider when you're doing a risk management. Let's look at some of the related terms pertaining to risk management. What is risk management? If you have to understand, you need to understand the vocabulary. And there are some basic terms. If you know these terms, you find understanding risk management becomes quite simple. The first is there is an asset which is being used in the organization. What's an asset? Asset could be the facilities, could be the technology, could be the information. Anything which is of value to the organization is an asset. Okay, asset need not necessarily be tangible, they can also be intangible assets. So you need to protect the assets. So if you look at the IP is an intangible asset. In fact, the beauty of information technology is that you may have the asset and still it can be stolen. So you need to protect not only by having it, but also ensuring that it doesn't get into the custody of somebody else. There's a vulnerability. What is the vulnerability? There is a weakness, which is an inherent weakness in the system. Okay, an inherent weakness account of the system safeguards. Next, you need to understand a threat. What is a threat? A threat is something which has the potential to harm the system or impact the system. For example, like I said, there could be a fire, there could be an earthquake, there could be a hacker, there could be employee ignorance. Exposure. Exposure is the extent of loss. When the threat exploits the vulnerability, it results in a risk, and that risk will result in an exposure. So when the threat exploits the vulnerability, there is a risk which materializes. This materialization of risk will result in an exposure, which is a potential loss. There is always a probability because risk is never uncertain, never certain. So you'll have a probability that the threat will succeed. For example, it could be possible that your system is being attacked, but you might have been protected. So there is a probability that the threat will succeed. When it succeed, to what extent will succeed, what will the impact, you can never estimate. But you have to make an estimate of what is the probability of the loss if that threat actualizes or the risk materializes. There is an attack, which is the threat. Exploiting the vulnerability is an attack. So these are a set of actions which are designed to compromise CIA. What is CIA? I'm sure you know. CIA stands for Confidentiality, Integrity, and Availability, and this is about security. Risk, we already discussed this. This is a potential harm if a threat exploits a vulnerability. What are countermeasures? Countermeasures are nothing but controls. The measures which are taken to counter the threat or the risk, to prevent the impact of the risk. So this will reduce the vulnerability, this will reduce the threat. Overall, what will happen is it will reduce the risk. And the objective is to bring this to an acceptable level. And that is the residual risk. Now we are clear? The risk which is still remaining after the countermeasures is what is called as the residual risk. So you need to remember there's a risk, you apply the countermeasures, which is the controls, and after that still there's a residual risk, and the residual risk need to be knowingly accepted. Why should we have a residual risk? Because the residual risk can never be eliminated. For example, there is a threat of a hijack. Now, how do you prevent the hijack? So you can have the airport security, you can have various types of deterrent, preventive, detective, and corrective mechanisms. In spite of that, still there could be hijack. So that is the residual risk we have to accept. Which means if you're traveling in the plane, in spite of all the measures which the police and the security and everyone takes, still there could be a risk that the plane could be hijacked, or the plane could be destroyed in an attack, or it could have an accident. Now let's understand what is the risk management cycle. So we know to counter the risk, we need to have a management system of implementing countermeasures, and this is done through the risk management. And let's understand the risk management cycle. So first of all, you need to identify what are the areas of risk. Assess this particular risk, and based on that, you develop the risk mitigation plan or the risk management plan. You implement the risk management plan, and then you re-evaluate the risk and check whether the risk still exists. So if you look at here, the first part, this is called as the risk assessment. The identifying the risk area, assessing the risk is called as the risk assessment. The second part, it's not enough if you understand the risk or assess the risk, you need to mitigate the risk. The risk mitigation includes developing the risk management plan, implementing the risk and management actions, and also doing a continuous re-evaluation. But risks because risks are always dynamic, they keep on changing. So you need to periodically re-evaluate the risk to see that you bring it to an acceptable level. Now, having understood the cycle, let's understand the process of risk management. This, as I said, is important because this topic is also covered in the business continuity plan. This is also relevant for information systems audit. So what will be the type of aspects you study in ISCA? All the modules you find you have to do risk management. Whether you are doing protection of information assets, whether you're doing governance, whether you're looking at SDLC, whether you're looking at BCP or application software or database software, application OS, any software or any aspect of technology, you will have to do risk management. So how is risk management done? Let's look at step by step. You identify and classify the information resources. Now look at the key term here. We are talking about not just resources, information resources, which means this could be physical assets or resources, which means information is also an asset. So you look at all the assets, the tangible and intangible assets that need to be protected. This is the key. You're not looking at assets which do not need protection, which means you're going to focus on what are the critical assets for the organization, which are of value, which are critical for the enterprise to continue the business operations. You assess the threats and vulnerabilities and the likelihood of their occurrence, the probability of their occurrence. So you have made a list of all the information resources and the assets which are used within the organization for delivering the business processes. And for each of them, you will assess what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities, and what are the likelihood of the occurrence and the probability. And once these elements of risk have been established or have been identified, you need to combine this, because if there is a fire, the fire is not going to impact just the building, it's going to impact the computers, it's going to impact the people, it's going to impact the documents, it's going to impact everything. So when you look at risk management for the impact of fire, you don't need to look at in isolation only a separate component, let's say the building or the computers or the people. You have to look at in totality. This is where you aggregate or combine the risk or the impact of the risk to form an overall view of the risk. Why is this important? Because when you aggregate the risk, you will decide what are the controls which are to be implemented. So it could be possible you have multiple risks, and all these multiple risks can be mitigated by implementing one type of control. You need to evaluate. Now look at the key term here, evaluate. So when you're doing risk management, there are always existing controls which are there. You need to understand what are the existing controls, and depending on the need, you need to design new type of controls to reduce the vulnerabilities to an acceptable level. So what is the vulnerability? This is where I said vulnerability is a weakness. So wherever possible, you reduce the weakness. For example, if you're using information technology and the information system, which is their information technology, can be hacked, can be accessed. So how do you reduce this? So this is an inherent weakness or vulnerability. How do you reduce this? You reduce this by having physical security. You reduce it by having logical security. You also reduce it by having right type of a network security. So ultimately, after applying this, you have what is called as the residual risk. So this is how risk management process is done. I'll be discussing this a little later in a little more detail, but I wanted to get this clarity on how risk management is done, the process of risk management. Now, why is risk management required? Now, this should be a no-brainer because risk management is required to manage the risk. Because if you don't manage the risk, you don't know what is going to hit you. Like they say, the biggest risk is the ignorance about the existence of the risk. If you don't know what risks are going to occur, what's going to happen, then you're definitely going to be in serious trouble. You're definitely going to be impacted with the risk because when the risk actualizes, you don't know what to do. Why risk management? Because there are numerous type of threats which are there, and there are numerous vulnerabilities. There are also varying impact levels. If the threat exploits the vulnerability, there are going to be impact, which is a potential loss, and there could be different types. For example, there could be fire. Now, there could be fire in the building, there could be fire in the data center, there could be fire in a particular canteen. So there could be fire at different places at different level to different extent, and that will have different levels of impact. So when you do risk management, you actually identify different types of scenarios, and then based on the decide what the right level of control is required. You know that security has to be implemented. For implementing security, you need to deploy resources, and resource comes with a cost. And cost always has a constraint. Cost always has a budget. So you need to ensure that you're able to get maximum value from the investment in security. And you also need to do due diligence, which means when you implement security, it is from the perspective of ensuring the regulatory requirements also. And many of the organizations, there is a regulatory requirement to protect the data. For example, the privacy regulations require for critical industries or for any organization which is collecting sensitive personal data or information to protect the privacy. And this is mandated by law. You also need to have due diligence and audit from an independent agency to confirm whether you're adhering to this. So there is also a return on investment, because if you want to be sure that you are able to get return on the investment, you need to have an effective system of risk management. Now let's look at the risks and exposures. So what are the risks and exposures? One, the business objectives may not be achieved. We said risk is anything which prevents you from achieving the business objectives. The user requirements by implementing the technology may not be met. Or there could be excessive cost. You are implementing a particular project and the costs are quite high. Or there could be competitive disadvantage. There could be incompatibility between the systems which are implemented. Or there could be missed opportunities. Or there is an excessive delay on account of the deployment of the systems. So there could be insufficient resources, or there could be inadequate controls. So you need to remember, any event which results in a potential loss will result in an exposure. So exposures could be dynamic depending on the organization. Now let's look at the different classes of threats, or the common class of threats. Whatever be the enterprise, you find there are certain common threats. Let's look at some of the common threats. There could be errors. Information technology is used by people, and when people perform this, you have errors. You could also have malicious damage or attack by hackers. It could be internal staff or it could be external attacks. Or there could be fraud which is committed by internal employees or by external employees. Or there could be theft. Or there could be equipment software or failure. Now let's do a threat assessment. So you look at threat assessment, you look at different types of risks. There could be internal risks or internal threats. There could be external threats. This could be physical. This could be environmental. This could be natural, accidental, or malicious. So these are the different forms of threats. So when you do a threat assessment, you're going to look at what are the different sources or the different forms in which these threats can come. This could be coming from internal sources, or this could be from external sources. This could be on account of the environment, or this could be an account of the physical, this will lack security. For example, the ATM itself is stolen. Okay, this could be an account of natural causes. For example, there is a flood, there is a storm, there is an earthquake, or this could be due to an accident which happens, or this could be malicious, so it could be a hacker attack, or then employee fraud. Now let's look at vulnerabilities, some examples. What are vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities, as I said, is inherent weakness. There's a lack of user knowledge because of which the user commits the error or fraud, or he shares the information because of which the hacker is able to attack the system. There could be lack of security functionalities, or the security functionalities which are available are not properly used. There could be poor choice of passwords because of which the systems are hacked, or the technology which is being used may not be tested, may not be reliable, may not be able to deliver the results which the enterprise wants, or there could be unprotected networks because of which the external hackers are able to get into the system and cause havoc or cause loss. So these are all the different types of vulnerabilities or inherent weaknesses in the systems. Now these are only examples. So when you do a risk management and assessment, what you actually do is you have to understand the business environment of that organization. In the business environment, you have to look at what are the type of the information resources which are being used. And in the information resources, what are the critical business processes which are being performed? And for the business processes, what are the different type of threats, vulnerabilities, and when the threat exploits the vulnerabilities, what are the different type of risks? And if the risk actualizes, what are the exposure or potential loss? Now you need to implement controls to bring this risk to an acceptable level. Now let's do the impact analysis. So this is also called as, in the business continuity planning, it's also called as BIA, which is business impact analysis. So you already seen the threats could come from different sources. It could come from environmental physical threats. There could be internal threats through the employees or vendors, or there could be sabotage, or there could be methods, various methods which are used for this internal threat. There could be external threats, and this could be the hackers. There could also be losses in the physical domain. Now you find increasingly the risk is increasing because of the network, because the information system is available on the internet, is available on the network. Earlier, let's say if you look at a cashier who is working in a bank, he had access to cash to his counter, which was in his custody. Or if you go to a branch, the maximum loss to the branch would be the cash which is available at the particular branch. Now you find the bank is using a core banking solution. Now, where is the cash? You don't need the cash. All the assets of the organization are available in information, and this information is available in a digital form, and this is available in a database. Now, if you can hack into the database directly, you can directly transfer the money from one particular bank or from one particular account to another account, even without going through the application software. Now, let's get into a little more detail to understand what the vulnerability. A vulnerability, as I said, is weakness, an inherent weakness that could be exploited to cause damage to the system. Now here we have an image of a lady who is enjoying the beautiful swim in the ocean. Okay. Now, is there a weakness? This lady is swimming in the ocean. What are the right of threats which could happen? What are the inherent weakness? She could drown. She may not know swimming properly. She could drown. Or there could be underlying threats which she doesn't know. She's enjoying this swim, but there is a shark. The shark is a threat. Now, as long as the shark is not interested in the lady, then there is no problem. There is no risk. But when the shark gets interested in the lady, then there is a risk. What is the risk? The shark may decide to have a meal, and the lady is gone inside the stomach of the shark. So in that case, the potential loss is loss of life. So threat is any event with the potential to cause harm to a system in the form of disclosure, modification, or destruction, or it could be denial of service. So this is in the context of information technology or information system. So how do you mitigate this risk? You mitigate the risk by implementing security. And security consists of confidentiality, which is protection of information, sensitive information. Integrity is ensuring the availability of information, the accuracy and completeness of information at all stages of processing. Availability is all about ensuring the information is available as and when required, not only now, but also in the future. Let's look at confidentiality. Confidentiality is about preventing unauthorized release of the information or unauthorized use of the system. So integrity is How do you preserve the information in all stages of processing to make the information trustworthy and reliable? And how do you prevent or avoid unauthorized modification of this information? Availability is the probability that a system is operational at any time, or in other words, the percentage of uptime. It's not enough if you have information security, which is mitigated, which is implemented to mitigate the risk. You need to ensure that this is auditable, which means you can validate against the external benchmark. So there is an external auditor who comes in and verifies whether the system has been effectively mitigated by implementing the right level of risk. So you will have to ensure what the management has done in terms of the risk management, measure it against an established criteria or a policy or a benchmark, which is internal or external, and confirm whether this risk management has been effectively done by implementing the right control measures or the controls. And these have been brought to, what has been brought to? The residual risks have been brought to an acceptable level. What is the reality of security? This is another important factor you should remember, that there are no absolutely secure systems and there are no absolutely reliable systems. So it means there's nothing absolute. What you need to do when you're implementing security is to bring the risk to a reasonable level. In IS audit also, if you remember the definition, we are talking about the IS auditors providing a reasonable assurance. You also know that increased security always comes with increased cost. For example, the type of security you have got in an airport, you cannot have in a bus station, or you cannot have it in a metro. Why? The risks are different. The cost for implementing security in the airport are balanced because of the risk, which are high, and the people who are traveling can also afford to pay the cost. The reality of security is there always has to be a trade-off between the cost for increasing the system control and security, which means that the cost for mitigating the risk by implementing controls, and the cost incurred as a result of the successful security breach. So you need to look at both, compare both this and validate what is the right level of security. And risk management is all about balancing the risk vis-a-vis the return. So it means by implementing certain risks by implementing certain type of controls, you need to bring the risk to an acceptable level, but there is also cost involved. And what is the benefit of implementing these controls? You also need to look at the cost benefit analysis. Let's look at the threat analysis. This is what is called as the risk analysis also. A process where all the possible threats to a system are identified. A list is made containing all the threats and the severity of each of the threats is created. And based on this, you decide how are you going to define the security policy. Let's understand the risk management process. If you remember, we had seen this earlier. Identify and classify the information assets. Value the information assets based on the criticality. Identify the potential threats to the information assets. Based on this, you do a risk assessment. What are the key factors to be considered in risk assessment? You look at the impact analysis. You also look at the likelihood assessment. And based on this, you develop the strategies for risk management. So what are the strategies for risk management? One is risk avoidance, which means you decide not to do that activity at all. For example, you want to invest in shares because you want to get a good return. But what is the risk? You know that you may lose all the money. So in that case, you avoid investing in that market itself. Now, risk mitigation, this most effective strategy which is used, which means you bring the risk to an acceptable level. Risk transfer, which means you transfer the risk to another agency, that is through by taking an insurance. Or there is the risk retention, which means you decide that the risk cannot be completely eliminated. This is primarily used for residual risk. You decide to go ahead with the risk, you decide to live with the risk. And this is all risk assessment is all about. Let's look at in detail the risk management strategy. You tolerate or accept the risk. You terminate or eliminate or minimize the risk. You transfer or share the risk. And to treat or mitigate the risk. Or you turn back. You decide I'm not going to go further in that particular business strategy. So understand this very clearly. This is depicted. The risk management strategy is depicted in this graphic. Now this lecture is not just to be heard, this is also to be seen, because a lot of clarity you'll get when you see the linkages in the flow. Risk you can avoid which means you don't decide to do the activity itself. You can mitigate by minimizing the risks, by applying the right level of controls. Or you transfer the risk. How do you transfer? By taking insurance. Or you share the risk with another entity. This also could be through insurance. Or finally, you accept. You decide to live with the risk, because if you're doing that particular activity, you will have to accept that risk. For example, even if you keep the money in a bank, there's a possibility the money could be lost. So you decide that you accept the risk. So there also probably you'll keep it in a public sector bank where you know is much more secure, although they give a lower return compared to a private sector bank. When you're doing risk management, you need to understand or keep in mind the business context. So risk management has to be done from a business perspective. What is the impact on the business? So you have the IT risk and you have the overall business risk, and these both merge together. Now look at this. And this is where you have something called enterprise risk management. And when you're doing risk management, ideally, the risk assessment should be done enterprise-wide. Let's look at in detail what is the risk avoidance. So it means you decide to exit from these activities or conditions that gives right to risk, which means that particular business lending is risky. So you decide not to lend money, instead of that you invest in different projects. Or you lend in a particular sector, it is a risk, so you decide to not lend in that particular sector at all. So this generally adopted when no other risk option is available or adequate. Okay, this may be also because you cannot share or transfer the risk, or you find the risk we cannot afford. The management says this risk is completely unacceptable. So risk reduction or mitigation, this is what I said is done mostly. Action is taken so the risk can be detected, followed by actions to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk or both. This is the most common way of responding to risk, and this is what is extensively used. So how do you do that? You do this by implementing the appropriate risk management practices. So it means you implement right level of controls. You also introduce control measures as required to reduce the impact of the threat or to reduce the vulnerability. Risk sharing or transfer, reducing the risk likelihood or the impact by transferring it to an external agency or by sharing a portion of the risk. Now common, as I said, example is the insurance and outsourcing. Clear? Let's go further. Risk acceptance. So this is what ultimately has to be done, because in spite of all the risks, you find that the risks are still existing, and this is where you decide that the loss has to be accepted. For example, they say the ship is safest in the harbor, but that is not where it's supposed to be. The ship has to be on the seas. But when the ship is on the sea, is there a risk? There is definitely a risk. So wherever possible, you reduce the risk, mitigate the risk, you decide the risk management strategy, but the ship still has to sail. Only then it will reach the destination. And when you reach the destination, when you're moving toward the destination, there are always going to be threats, there are going to be vulnerabilities, there are going to be various types of risks which could actualize. So risk acceptance is not ignorance of risk. Ignorance of risk means you don't know that risk can occur. So here risk acceptance means that you knowingly accept the risk. This is the key point here. So depending on the policy adopted by the organization, they decide that they will accept that particular level of risk. IT risk should be accepted only by the business management. Why by the business management? Because the business owners are the ones who are the decision makers. So they are the ones who have to accept the risk and see that they are brought to an acceptable level depending on the right level of investments. Now you also need to see here that you communicate the acceptance of the risk, and this is done by the senior management and the board, and it's communicated to all the staff. For example, the lending policy, to what sector do we lend, what is the rate at which we lend, to whom do we lend. This has to be based on the risk policy of the bank, and this has to be communicated, set by the senior management and communicated to all the employees of the organization. Now let's understand how do we evaluate the risk. So there is a risk which leads to an attack. The risk attack exploits the vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities have to be prevented. For that, you will have the preventive controls. The preventive control reduces the impact. So you can also have the corrective control, which decreases the impact. And you also have deterrent controls. What is the deterrent control? Deterrent control is like the security at the airport with the AK-47. So any person who is thinking of attacking knows that he could risk his life, so losing his life. So that is the deterrent control. So you have different types of risks which could arise, which could lead to an attack, which can exploit the vulnerabilities. Okay, so to mitigate this, you need to have various types of control. There could be deterrent controls, preventive controls, and you may also have corrective controls. So ultimately, all this will impact the risk in terms of reducing it. So the preventive control will protect the vulnerabilities, the deterrent control will reduce the likelihood, and the corrective controls also reduces the impact or decreases the impact. Now this slide is very important because this will give an overview of the relationship between the risk and the controls. So we know there are various types of threats. These threats will lead to, there are also vulnerabilities, and the organization also has got information assets. So you need to protect these information assets by having the right level of security. And if the risk materializes, there's going to be big impact on the business, and you need to have right level of safeguards. So now this is the relationship. Now let's understand how they're related. The threats exploit the vulnerabilities. We already seen this. Vulnerabilities expose the information assets, which will result in a loss to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is security. Now, which will cause exposure, which is a potential business loss. And this has to be limited by the risk management, by adopting the right risk management strategy, by having the right level of safeguards. So what will happen when you have the safeguard? They protect against the risk, against the threats. Now this is all the complete relationship between the risk and the controls. Now just remember, if you understand this, you visualize this. Okay, this is how threats is, this is what vulnerabilities, this is the information asset. If you're able to visualize and understand and internalize, you don't need to remember. It becomes very easy. You don't need to read many times. Now this is another this one to elaborate or once again explain the concept which we're discussing. Now you have threats, okay, which could lead to the attack, and you have deterrent controls. You have vulnerabilities which could be exploited by the attacker. The vulnerability will result in an impact. Now there could be, first level is the deterrent control. Deterrent control is like you have the security in the airport. It deters the person from actually attacking. So you'll have preventive controls which also protect against the vulnerabilities, or you may have detective controls. And finally, if it happens, you also have corrective controls. For example, there's a possibility there's a fire, which is caused by external elements or rogue elements. So what is the deterrent? You ensure you have people with the right level of security. So there is a physical security. There are cameras which are there to guard against and capture this information that could act as a deterrent. You also have preventive, which means somebody comes in, you have camera which detects, and there are people who can actually ensure that this incident is prevented. Or you have fire extinguishers or smoke detector alarm which can detect this. Okay. So if it happens, if there's a fire happen, there should be corrective measures, which is in terms of having the smoke extinguishers or the water sprinkler system which prevent the fire or extinguishes the fire. You may also have compensating controls which reduces the likelihood. So these are not actual controls which are there, but these are compensating controls, which means the right level of controls is required, may be too costly, so they may have a compensating control. For example, to implement controls through a physical may be difficult, so they may have a alternate control through the digital mechanism itself, or through technology it may be difficult, so they may have a control through the compensating control through manual control. For example, purchase orders could be modified in the system. So the compensating control for that could be every purchase order which is issued with an organization is physically signed by the purchase manager, and only then it is supposed to be approved. Let's look at some of the activities which are pertaining to risk management. You have risk management, where you do a risk assessment. Risk assessment consists of identifying the different types of risks. You do a risk analysis. You prioritize the risk depending on the business needs based on the impact. And then you do a risk mitigation or control, which is to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. You do a risk planning, and you also monitor the risks. Let's look at key governance practices of risk management. First, if you look at it from a governance perspective, you have three terms: evaluate, direct, and monitor. You'll find these are all pervasive. Wherever you have governance, you'll have the three concepts, which is evaluate, direct, and management. So the governance, when you're doing, the management at the top level, the board of directors have to evaluate risk management policy. They have to direct the risk management policy of the organization, and they have to ensure that these are effectively monitored. Now let's look at the management practices of risk management as given in COVID. So you collect data pertaining to all the business practices, all the business processes, the threats, vulnerabilities, etc. Based on the data which you collected, based on the risk management process or the risk management cycle, you analyze the risk. Based on the analysis, you decide to maintain the right level of risk profile as acceptable to the management. And then you articulate the risk, which means you communicate the risk to the staff. You define the risk management action portfolio. What is the action to be taken for different types of risks which happen? And then you respond to the risk, depending on the management strategy which is decided. Now, having covered an overview of risk management, let's look at what are the type of questions which you can get in the exam pertaining to risk management. Explain various sources of information system risk with examples. Now, if you remember, we already covered the different sources from which the risk can occur. Now, here remember, when you look at the question, understand the context. Here they're not talking about risks in general, they're talking about information system risks. Okay, when you're giving examples, give example pertaining to information risk, system risk, and not the general risks. So it means what are the different types of risks for the information systems which are used within the organization. That's what you have to provide in the question. So if you just go back to the slide, earlier slides, you'll be able to get the answer. Explain 4 strategies of risk management with examples. Now you should be very clear about what are the 4 strategies which you can adopt. First is you avoid, which means you decide not to do that activity. Second, you decide to minimize or mitigate. And third, you share or transfer. And the fourth one is you accept. Outline the various activities related to risk management. This also we have covered in detail. What are the steps to be followed? What are the process to be followed for risk management? This is what has to be properly explained. Now, when you answer the question, it's important you understand the context of the question, get the clarity on what is the context. The same question pertaining to risk management could be for information systems, could be pertaining to information technology, could be from a governance perspective. And also decide what is the number of marks for that question, whether it's a 4 marks or 8 marks. Depending on that, you have to provide the details. Explain the 3 governance practices. This we just covered. You know the 3 governance practices. Remember EDM, which is evaluate, direct, and monitor. Explain briefly the management practices. Now remember, this chapter is all about governance and management. Governance is what is done by the board of directors. Management is what is done by the operational management. So if you remember, just a few minutes back, we discussed this. You collect the data, and then we have the different steps. I'll not get into this detail because I've just explained this. Explain the relationship of the risks and the controls in the context of risk management. I'm sure you're very clear. Remember the equation. R ideally should be equal to controls, which means the risks should be equal to control. If the risk is greater than control, which means there is a residual risk, and this residual risk results in this will result in a control weakness. This control weakness has to be accepted. Okay. Now this has to be accepted. This is a residual risk. Okay. There could also be another equation. Control is greater than risk. Now, is it acceptable from an audit point of view? You find the organization is very well controlled. They are very good in controls. But you need to remember that controls always come with a cost, which means they're unnecessarily investing money on security, which is not required. So you need to bring the risk to an acceptable level. So this is the relationship of the risks and the controls. So which means, if you remember the equation, you got risks, which are mitigated by security, which have to be configured as per the need of the organization, which is control. And this is how it is, the relationship of risk and controls. Risk management, you would have understood now, is a key aspect of life. And for most organizations, risk management is critical. We have studied risk management here from the context of information system risk or IT risk or technology related risks. Now you would have seen within just 1 hour, we were giving you a complete landscape of all about risk management. Now let's go further and have a quick recap of what we discussed. So we're looking at information system risks and the risk management which has to be done. So fundamentally, risk management is about managing the risks. And here we are looking at information system risks. Information systems are implemented using technology. So you need to understand technology. Information systems primarily provide information, and this information uses information assets. Now these assets could be tangible, there could be intangible. When you're doing a risk management, you know fundamentally risk management is the interplay of threats, vulnerabilities, and the probability of the occurrence. When these three interact, you get this results in a risk. This risk results in an exposure, which is a potential loss. So to mitigate this risk, you need to ensure that you have the right level of controls. And that's where you call it as countermeasures, or these are also called as controls. And by doing this, we're able to bring this to the residual risks which are there, we bring it to an acceptable level. So we have different types of our sources of risk. We have discussed some of the key terms pertaining to risk management. And we saw the 4 strategies which could be adopted pertaining to risk management. I'm sure all of you remember this. The first strategy is to avoid. The second strategy is to mitigate or minimize, which is also called as risk treatment strategies. The third one is to actually share or transfer. And the fourth one is actually to what? To accept. You have to accept the risk. And we also said risk management has to be implemented in our organization using the best practices. So you could use the best practices framework such as COBIT or the BCP standards, etc. So you have governance practices for risk management. And we know that in the case of implementing any aspect pertaining to technology, you can look at from the governance perspective. When you implement practices pertaining to governance, these are called as governance practices. And we said these are only 3, which is EDM, Evaluate, Direct, and Monitor. You also have the management practices. I'm sure you know the distinction between governance and management. Governance is done by the board of directors. Management is done by the operation level. Governance provides the setting in the environment in which the management has to operate and implement or operationalize and make things happen. So governance decides what is to be achieved. Management decides how it is going to be achieved and they get things done. So you also have practices pertaining to risk management, which is to be implemented by the management. So here also we saw various actions, right from the process of collecting the data, evaluating the risk, analyzing the risk, responding to the risk, articulating the risk. Like that, we have different processes or practices pertaining to risk management. Risk management has to be implemented effectively because this is going to impact how the organization is going to survive and thrive. So the risk management has to be dynamically monitored. So if you have to monitor, you have to have a system of measurement. And this is where metrics come to the picture. So we gave you some examples of different types of metrics which could be used. If you remember, I said risk management is important not only in the information systems risk management is integral to information technology. Risk management is integral to the enterprise as a whole. So when the enterprise is using information technology as a building block for the purpose of achieving the goals, then there could be certain incidents or potential events which can prevent the enterprise from achieving its objectives. And these are called as risk. And this risk could arise from threats. This could arise from the vulnerabilities. When the threat exploits the vulnerability, it results in a risk. Now, this risk need to be mitigated by implementing the right level of controls or countermeasures. Okay, the objective is to bring this to an acceptable level, and these are called as residual risks. This chapter is very important. This concept is also very important because risk management is what you do in BCP also. Because the first step in business continuity planning is to actually do risk management. If you're doing protection of information assets, the first step in protection of information assets is to do a risk management. So in all aspects pertaining to information systems control and audit, you'll have risk management, which is critical. I hope this 1 hour presentation has given you a clarity of what risk management is all about. I suggest that you go back, practice, read the study material once again, and you'll find it becomes much more simpler and easier to understand. You'll also see the same concept of risk management covered in this chapter 1 or also covered in chapter 4 in a little more detail, but from the context of business continuity planning. But once you know the underlying theme, the concepts, and you have a clarity about the concepts of the risk management or the subject matter, you find you will be able to understand and answer any questions. Not only that, you can internalize and apply it in any of your work area. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation and you learned from this presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to meeting you again in the next presentation. So use the study material, practice, understand the concepts, make your own mind map so that it becomes internalized. ISCA is definitely easy if you understand. So wish you all the best and see you again. Bye.